Today we're going to be talking about surveys and survey research. A survey, also known as a questionnaire, is a document with a bunch of items that are designed to solicit some kind of information from participants. And this document can be electronic or physical. These items, which are either questions or statements, are concerned with eliciting information about aspects of a participant's social life. And particularly in social research, these items are designed to measure a participant's attitudes, beliefs, perceptions, and orientations about their own lives and about the social world. So we have two types of items: closed-ended items and open-ended items. Closed-ended items are those in which the participant is asked to select from a predetermined set of responses. They can only select those responses. Importantly, these closed-ended items need to meet two criteria. First, they need to be exhaustive, meaning if you're going to have a participant select from a list of options, you need to provide all possible options. This is particularly important when it comes to questions that deal with things like race or ethnicity. When you're asking about somebody's race, for example, you can list white, black, Latinx, Asian American, Native American, so on and so forth. However, in the case of race or ethnicity, it might be wise to include a final option known as other. That way, if they don't fall into any of the predetermined categories, they can select other. And then the second criterion that it needs to fulfill is being mutually exclusive. And this means that participants should only be able to select one of the possible answers. For example, if you have the question of age, they can't select that they are both 18 and 19. They are either 18 or they are 19. With a question like race, it's very difficult to be mutually exclusive because many people have multiple racial and ethnic backgrounds. So that is an exception. And then next we have open-ended questions. So whereas closed-ended questions are a predetermined list that somebody can select, open-ended questions allow for the participant to provide their own answers. Importantly, when you have open-ended questions, the researcher must know that those responses must be coded before they are analyzed. These open-ended questions are really important for things that require interpretation. They're important for more qualitative types of responses where you want to allow the participant to elaborate. Here are some examples of closed-ended and open-ended questions. We have things like annual income. Somebody can't make both $34,000 a year and $75,000 a year. We have Likert type items listed in the closed-ended section. And then we have open-ended. And we see here there's just an open box where you can fill in your response. So rather than selecting one of the responses, you allow the participant to respond in any way they see fit. When it comes to constructing these items, there are many things that the researcher should consider. First, make sure that the items are clear. You don't want to be ambiguous in what you mean. The items should be short. You want your participant to be able to quickly read and understand it. The item should be relevant. The participant should be able to understand how this one item relates to the larger survey. Avoid double-barreled items. You only want to discuss one topic per item because you don't want to confuse the participants. Avoid negative items, so exclude words like not, because those words can easily confuse the respondent. The respondent should be able to answer. They should meet some age requirement and have had experience with this topic. So if you ask somebody who's 15 years old how many alcoholic beverages they had in the past week, they should not be able to answer that question because they don't meet age requirements for drinking alcoholic beverages. In addition, you want to make sure that relevant experience that they've had is not too far in the distant past, that they can recall it with some degree of accuracy. So you don't want to ask about something that occurred 20 years ago. Respondents also must be willing to answer. Some questions or statements that are brought up might be sensitive, so you want to make sure that they're going to be willing to answer by ensuring the confidentiality of their responses as well as their own anonymity. Finally, you want to avoid biased terms. You don't want to sway the participant to respond in a certain way that is amenable to the question that you asked. Survey construction is also important. You want your respondent to be eager to complete the survey. You want it to be visually appealing to the respondent. Some pointers are to keep the survey uncluttered, one question per line, Make sure that your survey follows a consistent format. You're not changing between one question per line and 3 questions per line, and then right-handed questions, and then justified questions, and then left-handed questions. You want to keep it consistent across the entire survey. And finally, item ordering. In your survey, you want to have introductory comments about the survey, the purpose of the survey, who you are, clear instructions, and then move all of your demographic questions to the end. As they're wrapping up the survey, their attention or interest in the survey tends to decrease. So you want to leave the easier questions for them at the end, the easier being those demographic questions. What is your sex? What is your gender? What is your age? What is your income? What is your student status? Those kinds of questions. Those are easily answerable because they don't have to think about their attitudes or their beliefs or their perceptions. So survey logic is this notion that you have questions or items in your survey that you only want a subset of participants to answer. For example, you have an item that asks, have you ever smoked marijuana? Yes or no. You have another item that says, how many times in the last week have you smoked marijuana? So logic is this idea that you are only giving that second question, how many times have you smoked marijuana in the last week, to those who responded yes in the previous question. You don't want to ask the question, how many times you smoked marijuana, to people who said, I've never smoked marijuana. You're only giving certain questions to people based on how they responded in previous questions. We have 2 types of survey administration. On one hand, we have self-administered surveys, meaning that the participants themselves are taking the survey. And then we have interviewer-administered. Interviewer-administered surveys are those in which an actual interviewer comes out and gives the participant the survey. They watch the participant as the participant takes the survey. Most surveys nowadays are self-administered, and that's because interviewer-administered surveys are often too costly. You have to hire somebody to go out and watch somebody take a survey, whereas self-administered surveys you can do any day, any time. A key aspect and sometimes pitfall of survey research is response rate. So response rate is the percentage of people who actually completed the survey out of the total number of people who were selected in the sample. The ideal response rate is over 70%. For many of the federally funded research surveys like the Census or the American Community Survey, we're looking for something around 80 or 85% response rate, meaning that 80 or 85% of those people selected in the sample actually responded to the survey. In reality, response rate has been decreasing since about the 50s. In many surveys nowadays, the response rate is around 10 to 20%. And that's sometimes attributed to the ballooning in the number of surveys that exist out there. Many people are less inclined to take surveys. Sometimes surveys are seen as intrusive. So fewer and fewer people are participating in surveys nowadays. Here we see 10% in commercial surveys. We see around 60% in some federally funded surveys. So what are some problems and solutions for response rates? Low response rate is bad because a smaller sample usually means that that sample is less representative of the population. Those who do participate might be systematically different than non-participants. So how do we fix this? How do we improve response rate? Some of the suggestions are to, instead of using self-administered surveys, start using interviewer-administered surveys. We know that they typically yield higher response rates. If you have an interviewer giving the survey, the participant is less likely to say, oh, I don't know, or I'm not going to give an answer. And that's because the interviewer can encourage respondents to give a response. And again, they can guard against any confusion in items. If an item is sort of confusing, the interviewer can clarify it for the respondent, thereby increasing the likelihood that they will respond to that question. Of the self-administered survey type, we have 2 distinctions. We have mail-in surveys and we have web surveys. Mail-in surveys are mailed to the participants in the sample. There are hard copies of the surveys that are sent along with instructions on how to complete the survey, stationery, and postage for returning that completed survey. I will note that these mail-in surveys have many costs associated with them, not only the costs associated with devising the survey, the items, and constructing the visual layout, but also with distribution of those hard copies, paying for making those copies, paying for follow-up mailings if people haven't completed the survey yet, and or incentives for completion. Oftentimes when you want to increase response rate, you may mail out an incentive saying, hey, if you complete this, we'll give you an Amazon gift card, or we'll send along a check for a certain amount of money. So all of those are costs associated with mail-in surveys. And next we have web surveys, where participants, instead of being mailed a hard copy, they're emailed a link to an electronic or web survey. So yes, there are costs associated with devising the survey, the items, the visual layout. However, distribution won't be costly because you're sending it via the internet. Follow-up mailings are just going to be follow-up emails, and the only costs that are associated with web surveys are incentives for participation, so paying people for actually completing the survey. So here's some guidelines when you're constructing and sending out self-administered surveys. The survey itself should use simple language. Don't use jargon at all in your survey. Use simple lay terms. The researcher should also test out which incentives tend to increase participation in the survey. And finally, the researcher should limit these surveys to less than 15 minutes. Oftentimes people don't have a lot of time to engage in these surveys, so keeping it to about 10 or 15 minutes is going to be ideal for increasing response rate. For example, if you were told, take this survey, it'll only take 5 to 10 minutes, you are more likely to take that survey because it's such a small amount of your time compared to being sent a link for a survey that's going to take an hour to an hour and a half. For web surveys in particular, the researcher should not force excessive scrolling. So you want to keep your survey short enough to where the participant doesn't have to scroll nonstop to get to different parts of the survey. Finally, for web surveys in particular, be aware of technical limitations. You don't want to have your survey hosted on a website that's not viewable on a phone, or it's only viewable on an iPhone and not an Android phone. So you want to test out how your survey appears on various platforms, whether that's iPads, whether that's a phone, whether that's a computer, just to be sure that it's working on all platforms. Next, we have the interviewer-administered surveys. We have two types of interviewer-administered surveys. We have face-to-face surveys and telephone surveys. So face-to-face surveys are those in which the interviewer actually physically meets up with the participant and reads the items to the participant. Those increase the likelihood that the participant is going to actually complete the survey. However, there are a lot of costs associated with it. Not only do we have the costs of creating the survey and incentives for participation, but we also have the costs for the interviewers themselves. The interviewer has to be paid. They have to be trained on how to deliver the survey. They have to be paid for travel to these participants. And then we have to pay for supplies, physical copies, and administration tools. How are we giving the surveys? Pens and papers, things like that. Secondly, we have the telephone and or web survey, where an interviewer will meet with a participant via some alternative medium, whether that's a webcam or a phone, and they will read these questions orally to the participant. The cost associated with telephone or webcam surveys are still going to be administration tools and incentives for participation, but they're also going to include interviewer pay, phone or internet expenses, if the sample is selected using random digit dialing, or the interviewer is interviewing the participant via computer-assisted telephone interview, the researcher is going to have to pay for random digit dial samples as well as the caddy expenses. Down here I have notes. We have RDD, which is random digit dialing, random numbers selected from a range of active telephone numbers, and then computer-assisted telephone interviewing is a data collection technique in which the interviewer relies on a computer and reads the survey to the person on the other end of the line. So there are some guidelines when it comes to interviewer-administered surveys, particularly for interviewers. First, the interviewers have to be trained, so they have to engage in practice interviews as well as quote-unquote real interviews. So they practice one-on-one with other interviewers, giving example questions. And then the quote-unquote real interviews include going through the actual survey with some member of the public who's not in the sample. The reason for this training is because we want the interviewer to learn how to handle these difficult situations where, for instance, a participant is yelling at them. A participant says, I'm on the no-call list. Why am I being interviewed or sampled? Difficult situations like non-response, difficult situations such as clarity or lack thereof in a question. And then secondly, you want the interviewer to become familiar with the questionnaire. You want them to be able to preempt some of the next questions that a participant might ask, or prepare them for questions that they're going to get later in the survey. For the interview, and this is particularly important for face-to-face interviews and webcam interviews, we want the interviewer to dress appropriately, dress in ways that convey that you're administering a professional survey. You're representing the researcher or the university or the company. Dressing appropriately can also mean that you're matching the dress of the participant. For example, if you're interviewing coal miners in the 1900s, an interviewer doesn't want to come to the coal mine in a three-piece business suit. The interviewer wants to match their dress to the dress of the people they are interviewing. Second, follow question wording exactly. And this is because we don't want to bias how we're asking the questions of the participants. We want to ensure that each participant is getting the same treatment in terms of how they're being asked these questions. You also want to record those responses exactly. And finally, when necessary, the interviewer should probe, asking follow-up questions of the participant, or asking them to clarify, or clarifying for the participant so that we can get the best complete answer to that question. If we wanted to compare self-administered surveys to interviewer-administered surveys, we can get a better picture of what will work best for our research question. For self-administered surveys, we know that they're going to be cheaper and faster than interview-administered surveys because we don't have to pay an interviewer, we don't have travel expenses or anything like that. Between mail and web, we know that web is cheaper than mailing because we don't have to deal with costs for paper or stationery or follow-up mailings. If you are mailing, a national mailing system is going to be the same cost as local mailing. However, it's going to require a staff to manage the responses as well as the follow-ups. This is why web is going to be cheaper, because you're sending out an email and the person managing that survey and that response is just one person. Oftentimes you can get an auto response when a survey is completed. You can oftentimes also send out an auto reminder when a participant hasn't submitted or completed a survey within a time frame. With the self-administered survey, respondents are going to be more willing to answer controversial items than they would be in an interviewer-administered setting. And why is that? Well, they're in the comfort of their own home. They don't feel like they're going to be judged by an interviewer being there, so they're more free to answer openly and honestly. With an interview-administered survey, there are fewer incomplete questions. The interviewer can probe or encourage a participant to answer a question. The interviewer-administered survey is going to be more effective for more complicated questionnaires. If you have complicated follow-up questions or complicated logic, the interviewer can follow that. Face-to-face of these versions is more intimate. However, telephone/webcam is going to be cheaper and more time efficient because you're not having to go and physically meet up with this person. When comparing telephone to webcam, we know that most people have phones, fewer people have internet or data packages, so it might be particularly important for your research purposes to use telephone methods over webcam methods. The telephone webcam method, when compared to face-to-face interview-administered surveys, is going to be safer. And this is because you're not going into someone's physical space or home to interview them. There's distance between the interviewer and the participant. However, when it comes to telephone-administered surveys, you might have many more opt-outs. You might have unlisted numbers or do not call numbers, or you might reach voicemails. So these are all important considerations for when you're going out into the field or when you're collecting data via survey. I do want to point out that surveys are the most used type of secondary data. So to refresh, we know that secondary data analysis is a form of research in which the data are collected by one researcher and they're made available to be analyzed by other researchers. So you're not the primary researcher collecting the data, but you can use those data. So I have here that surveys, especially large federally funded surveys, are the most common method of creating secondary data for other researchers. We know that the census or the American Community Survey or Uniform Crime Reports or the AdHealth dataset, these are all surveys that were administered to people and that are made publicly available. And some have restrictions, some don't, but they are available for other researchers. And finally, I want to point out that it's important to consider the ethics of survey design. Surveys often ask for a bunch of private information. As a researcher, it's your job to make sure that this information is kept confidential. And very importantly, if your survey asks questions that could create psychological discomfort or cause harm, it's the job of the researcher to try to minimize that risk or minimize that harm, and also debrief the participant about what aspects could be harmful to them after they're done with the survey.